She signed her name one final time on a document she had spent 40 years building toward. And she did not cry. She did not smile. She simply set down the pen, listened to the click of it against the marble desk, and thought, "So this is what it feels like to hand someone a knife and watch them not even thank you for the handle." Her name was Eleanor Voss. She was 63 years old, and she had been here before. Not in this room, not in this particular glass tower with its view of a harbor she had never learned to stop loving, where the water shifted between green and gray, depending on what the sky decided to feel that morning. Not with this particular stack of transfer documents. Not with this particular notary, who kept clearing his throat as though the silence between signatures were something that needed to be managed. But the feeling, the specific, quiet, almost pleasant feeling of watching herself make the same catastrophic mistake for the second time in her life, that feeling she knew exactly. She had trusted someone completely. She had believed, with the full force of a mind that had navigated 40 years of business, betrayal, loss, and reconstruction, that this time was genuinely different, that this person was genuinely different. Eleanor picked up her coat from the chair beside the desk. The leather was soft in the way that only old things are soft, worn down by years of contact, by the particular pressure of the same hands returning to the same places again and again. She had bought this coat in a year when she had nothing, in a second-hand shop on a street she could no longer find on any map because the city had swallowed it whole and replaced it with a parking garage. She had kept the coat because it reminded her of the woman she had been in that year. Resourceful, undefeated, capable of warmth even in a winter that had no mercy in it. She put the coat on. She nodded to the notary. She walked out. In the elevator, descending from the 31st floor, she caught her own reflection in the polished steel doors and held its gaze. The woman looking back at her had silver hair cut short and precise, dark eyes that had not softened with age so much as deepened, and a stillness about her that people who didn't know her often mistook for serenity. People who did know her recognized it as something else entirely. It was the stillness of a person who has already decided. Eleanor had decided 3 months ago. The elevator opened into the lobby. She walked through it without stopping, through the revolving door, out into the salt-edged air of a city that still, after everything, felt like hers. She did not look back at the building. She had work to do. The harbor district where Eleanor had grown up was not the harbor district that existed now. The one she had grown up in smelled of diesel and fish and the particular metallic tang of the canneries that used to line the eastern docks, where her father had worked for 31 years and come home every evening with his hands smelling of the sea in a way that no amount of soap ever fully removed. She had loved that smell. She had associated it with safety, with the particular security of a man who showed up every day and brought something home, even if that something was modest, even if that something left marks on his skin that would never entirely fade. Her father had taught her 2 things above all others. The first was that honest work was its own reward, which she had believed completely until she was old enough to understand that honest work was its own reward only if you were also willing to be very, very patient. The second was that a person's word was the only currency that could never be inflated away, which she had believed her entire life without exception, even after the world had given her several significant reasons to reconsider. It was the second belief that had brought her here, to this specific morning, to the inside of this decision she had been building, quietly and alone, for the past 91 days. Her office was not in the glass tower. It had never been in the glass tower. Her office was in a building 3 blocks from the water, in a neighborhood that had not yet been discovered by the kind of money that erases neighborhoods and replaces them with versions of themselves that are cleaner and emptier and smell of nothing. The building was 4 stories, brick, with wide windows that let in the harbor light in the morning in a way that still, after 22 years in that space, made her pause at the door of her own office and simply look. She had built her company in that building, Voss Maritime Consulting, which was a precise and slightly dull name for a firm that had spent 2 decades doing something that was actually quite extraordinary. It had served as the bridge between the old harbor economy, the fishing families, the small freight operators, the independent dock workers who had operated on handshake agreements for generations, and the new one, the one built on digital logistics and international shipping contracts, and the kind of infrastructure investment that required a person who could sit at the same table as both a third-generation fisherman who did not trust anyone in a suit and a Singapore-based investment consortium that had never once thought about the smell of diesel or the weight of a net. Eleanor was that person. She was the bridge. She had been born in the old world, in a house 3 blocks from the docks, in a family that knew every family on the waterfront by name and by wound, and by the specific way they held themselves at funerals. And she had built herself, through education and stubbornness and what her mother had called a truly inconvenient refusal to accept limits, into someone who could walk into any room in the new world and not merely survive it, but command it. The bridge was, she had come to understand, also her deepest vulnerability. Because bridges, by definition, are exposed on both sides. She met Daniel Marsh at a conference 7 years ago. He was 41 at the time, 15 years younger than she was, with a quality she had spent the subsequent years trying to find the right word for, and had finally settled on: attentiveness. He was the most attentive person she had ever encountered. He listened in a way that made you feel your words were being held carefully, turned over, examined for their full weight. He remembered small things, the name of her late husband, mentioned once in passing, the specific coffee she ordered, the fact that she always arrived at meetings slightly early and used those minutes to stand at the window rather than sit at the table. She had noticed the attentiveness and filed it as a quality she respected. She had not, at the time, considered it as a methodology. Daniel had come from a background that mirrored hers in its outline, while differing in its texture. He had grown up in a port city too, a different one, farther north, colder, harder, in a family that had operated a small freight company for 3 generations before losing it in a contract dispute that, by his account, had been orchestrated by a larger operator who had seen an opportunity and taken it without conscience. He spoke about that loss with a measured, careful grief that Eleanor had recognized immediately and completely, because she had felt something similar at the age of 29 when a business she had built from nothing had been dismantled by a partner who turned out to have been laying groundwork for that dismantling from the very first day they shook hands. She had been betrayed once before. She had sworn it would never happen again. She had looked at Daniel Marsh and thought, here is someone who understands what it costs to have something taken from you. Here is someone who has learned from that loss the same things I learned from mine. She had been wrong, but she would not know how wrong for another 4 years. The company that Eleanor had built over 20 years was not a large company by the standards of the industry. It employed 43 people, operated out of the brick building and 2 satellite offices, and generated revenue that was respectable without being the kind of number that attracted the attention of the sharks. What made Voss Maritime Consulting genuinely valuable, worth far more than its revenue suggested, was something that could not be easily copied. It was the trust. The trust of the old harbor families, who had watched Eleanor grow up among them, and who had, over 2 decades, come to believe that she would not sell them out to the new money, regardless of what the new money offered. And the trust of the institutional clients, the port authorities, the international freight operators, the infrastructure funds, who had come to understand that Eleanor Voss had access to a community that no amount of PR strategy or community outreach budget could purchase, because it was built on something older and more durable than strategy. She had spent 20 years building that bridge, and its foundation was her name. When Daniel Marsh joined the firm 6 years ago, he joined as a senior consultant. He was good. He was, in fact, excellent. He had a fluency in the institutional world that complemented Eleanor's fluency in the harbor world, and within 18 months he had become indispensable in a way that felt organic and right, the way a missing piece of something feels when it finally arrives. He had also, within those 18 months, begun to understand exactly how the bridge worked. Not the mechanics of it, the contracts, the relationships, the specific knowledge she carried about who owed what to whom, about which families would accept which kinds of development and which would not, about the 17 informal agreements that kept the old harbor economy alive in a landscape that was trying very hard to eliminate it. He had come to understand all of that, but more than that, he had come to understand the principle of it, that everything Voss Maritime Consulting was, everything it was capable of doing, rested entirely on Eleanor's name, on her reputation, on the accumulated trust of 40 years of being, in her father's phrase, a person whose word meant something. That understanding was the weapon he had spent the next 4 years sharpening. The first sign was so small that Eleanor had dismissed it entirely. A phone call from Miriam Taggart, who ran the Taggart family's deep-sea fishing operation from the same building her grandfather had built in 1961, in which Miriam had mentioned, in passing, in the way that you mention something you're not sure is important enough to mention directly, that she had heard from someone, she didn't say who, that Voss Maritime was considering recommending the sale of the Eastern Docks leasehold to the Carrington Group. Eleanor had told Miriam that this was not true, had never been discussed, and that she would look into where the rumor had originated. She had told Daniel about the call that same afternoon. She remembered his expression, a slight frown, a shake of the head, the specific quality of concern that looked genuine, and was. She had believed it was genuine because it looked exactly the way genuine concern looked on the face of someone who shared her values, who had experienced what she had experienced, who understood what a rumor like that could do to relationships that had taken decades to build. She had not considered at the time that the best way to understand what a rumor can do is to be the person who started it. 2 months later, a second call, this one from old Marcus Fenn, who had operated the northern freight dock since before Eleanor had graduated high school, and who had the specific directness of a man who had been in the water during a shipwreck and had since developed an impatience with anything that wasn't the full truth. Marcus did not mention rumors. He asked Eleanor directly, had she signed a letter of support for the Carrington Group's rezoning application for the eastern waterfront? She had not. She was certain she had not. She told Marcus she was certain she had not. After she hung up, she went to Daniel's office. His door was open. He was at his desk, reviewing something on his screen, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, with the particular quality of attention that she had, over 6 years, come to feel as a kind of warmth, a kind of being truly seen. She asked him about the rezoning application. She described what Marcus had told her. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully that he had heard something similar. A rumor, he thought, probably originating from the Carrington Group's PR team, who were known to manufacture community support documentation to smooth their applications. He said he had been meaning to look into it. He said she was right to be concerned. He said he would handle it. She thanked him. She went back to her office. She sat at her desk, looking out at the harbor, and felt the thing she had felt 40 times in her career. The particular unease of a situation she didn't fully understand yet. Not alarm, not suspicion, just the quiet awareness that something in the room had moved slightly, and she wasn't sure what. and she wasn't sure where it was now. She had felt this before. The last time she had talked herself out of it. She had trusted, and the trust had cost her everything she had built in the first decade of her professional life, and it had taken her 6 years to rebuild. She was not going to make that mistake again, she told herself. She went home that evening. She cooked dinner. She stood at the window of her apartment overlooking the harbor and watched the lights come on, one by one, across the water. The fishing boats, the freight terminals, the blinking red light at the end of the North Pier that she had watched since childhood, always in the same rhythm, a pulse she had internalized so deeply that she sometimes felt it when she was away from the harbor, like a second heartbeat keeping time. She thought about her father's hands, the smell of the sea, the weight of a word that meant something. She thought, I need to be very careful, and I need to start now. What Eleanor did next was not dramatic. It was not the action of someone in a story, someone who flips a table or confronts a villain in a doorway or makes a speech. It was the action of a 63-year-old woman who had been in business for 40 years and who had learned, through 2 of the most painful experiences of her life, that the only way to understand what is being done to you is to slow down, document everything, and refuse to telegraph that you know. She started keeping a record, not on her company system, on a notebook. The same kind she had used since her first year in business, a plain black hardcover with no markings on the outside, bought in packs of 6 from a stationery shop that had been in the same location since 1978. She had been through hundreds of these notebooks over the decades. She kept them all, dated and shelved in her home office, in the event that she ever needed to reconstruct her own history. In the new notebook, she began writing down small things. The exact phrasing of what Marcus had told her about the rezoning application, the date, the time, the weather. She always noted the weather. It was a habit from her father, who believed that weather was context, that you couldn't fully understand any event without knowing what the sky was doing at the time. The name Miriam had not given her, the specific language Daniel had used when she reported Marcus's call to him. She also began to review the firm's files more carefully, not in a way that would be noticed. She was the owner, she reviewed files regularly, but with a different quality of attention. She was looking for patterns, for small inconsistencies between what she knew to be true and what the documents said, for the particular evidence of things that had been moved without being obviously moved. She found it 6 weeks after Marcus's call. It was in a correspondence file, an exchange of emails between Daniel and a contact at the Carrington Group, conducted through a personal email address that Daniel had used from his work computer, which meant it had been captured in the firm's automatic backup system. The exchange was brief, professional, and devastating. In it, Daniel was not introducing himself to the Carrington Group. He was updating them. Continuing a conversation that had been going on, it became clear from the language. For considerably longer than 6 weeks, he was reporting on the status of 4 families, including the Taggarts, including Marcus Fenn, and specifically on their likelihood of resistance to the eastern waterfront development. And he was reporting in a way that made clear he had access to information no outside consultant should have had, including the specific financial pressures each family was facing and the exact terms of their lease agreements with the Port Authority, information that Eleanor had shared with him in confidence as her most trusted colleague, because building the bridge required her to know the vulnerabilities of both sides, and she had believed, with the full force of her experience and judgment, that he was as committed to protecting those vulnerabilities as she was. She closed the file. She sat very still for a long moment. Outside the window, the harbor moved in its patient, indifferent way. Then she opened a second notebook, also plain, also black, also purchased in the same shop, and she began to write a different kind of record. Not of what had already happened, of what she was going to do next. The thing about Daniel Marsh that Eleanor came to understand over the following weeks, as she moved carefully through the architecture of what he had built, was that he was genuinely skilled. Not merely conniving, skilled. He had constructed something elegant, something that, if she had not been paying the specific kind of attention she was now paying, would have been very close to perfect. The plan, as she pieced it together, was not new. It had a long history in the kind of business that intersected with real estate development and community trust, and it worked like this. You positioned yourself as a trusted intermediary. You cultivated that trust over years, carefully, genuinely, because real trust required real investment, and the target had to believe completely. You gathered intelligence about both sides of the bridge. You identified the pressure points, financial, personal, historical, that could be used to move each party in the direction you needed. And then, at the right moment, you leveraged the trusted intermediary's name, not your own, to move the development forward, pocketing the facilitation fees that no one would trace back to you because, as far as everyone was concerned, the intermediary had simply changed their position. And Eleanor's name would be destroyed in the process. The Harbor families would believe she had betrayed them. The institutional clients would believe she had behaved unethically. Voss Maritime Consulting, built on 40 years of trust, would collapse. Daniel Marsh would have the relationships, because he would be the one to step forward, contritely, carefully, as the person who had tried to warn Eleanor and been ignored, who had only reluctantly participated in passing information to the Carrington Group because he had believed, naively, that Eleanor was steering toward an agreement that would benefit everyone. He would emerge as the trustworthy one, the reformer, the bridge builder who had been forced out of a corrupt firm. He had constructed a character, and that character was built entirely from her story. She thought about the first betrayal, the partner, 29 years ago, who had spent 3 years carefully laying the groundwork for the moment he would take everything and walk away. She had trusted him. She had believed, genuinely and completely, that the trust was reciprocal. And now she had done it again. She had looked at Daniel Marsh and thought, here is someone who has learned from loss. Here is someone who understands. She had been right that he understood. She had been wrong about what he intended to do with that understanding. She held the second black notebook in her hands, looked at the first entry she had made the night she found the email chain. Her handwriting was steady. It had been steady for 40 years. Her father's hands had smelled of the sea. Her hands had always written in a straight, deliberate line, regardless of what was happening inside her. False belief, she wrote at the top of a new page. Then, beneath it, this time is different. This person is different. She underlined it twice. Then she turned to a fresh page and kept working. She called Marcus Fenn on a Thursday. She had chosen Thursday because Marcus always drove his boat out on Wednesday mornings and came back Thursday afternoons, and the particular quality of tiredness in him after a day on the water made him, paradoxically, more frank, not less. He was less guarded when his body was tired, more willing to say the thing he had been thinking without the protective layer of social management. She did not tell him she had discovered anything. She told him she was doing a review of some firm operations and needed to verify something. She mentioned, carefully, that she had heard that a letter of support for the Carrington application had been circulating, with her signature on it, and she wanted to know if he had seen it or could describe it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, he had seen it. He had received it 3 weeks ago, forwarded from someone in the Port Authority office. It had looked like her signature. He hadn't been sure. He had asked around to find out whether other people had received it. Several had. That was why he had called her. Could he send her a copy? She asked. He could. She received it 20 minutes later. She printed it, held it, and spent a long time looking at her signature, or rather, at the signature that looked like hers. She had seen forged signatures before. This was not a poor forgery. It was, in fact, remarkably good. The specific pressure points, the slight leftward lean she had developed in her 50s, the way the second letter of her last name ran slightly longer than the first, all of it was there. It had been practiced, over time, by someone who had spent years watching her sign things. She photographed the letter. She added it to the file she was building, which now existed in 3 forms: the physical notebooks, a digital record on a device that had never connected to the firm's system, and an encrypted backup she had sent, in pieces, to a person she trusted with a totality that had never once been challenged. That person was her daughter. Her daughter, Nora, was 34, lived in another city, and worked as a legal investigator. They spoke twice a week. Nora had known, from the third conversation in which her mother mentioned Daniel Marsh, that something about the situation warranted watching. She had not said this directly. She had a precision about language that Eleanor had always admired, but she had asked, very gently, whether her mother had a record of the agreements they had reached about his role at the firm. Eleanor had appreciated the question. She had gone back and read every email, every memo, every meeting note, and she had found in that review the first small thing she had not noticed at the time. In the original terms of Daniel's employment, in language that she now understood had been drafted partly by him and reviewed by her with the comfortable trust of someone who believed she was reading boilerplate, there was a clause about client relationship ownership that would, in the event of the firm's dissolution or Eleanor's retirement, assign certain client relationships to Daniel as the managing consultant of record. A small thing, a reasonable-seeming thing, the kind of thing you include in a contract when you are building a career within a firm and want to protect your professional equity. Or the kind of thing you include when you are building toward a moment when you will need to control what happens to those relationships after the firm's reputation has been deliberately destroyed. Nora received the materials in fragments over a period of 6 weeks. She said nothing about them in their regular calls. She asked about the harbor. She asked about the coat. She asked once about the blinking red light at the end of the North Pier, whether it was still going. It was still going, Eleanor told her. Good, Nora said. Some things should stay the same. 3 months after Eleanor had signed the document in the glass tower, the transfer document, the document that had felt like handing someone a knife, she sat in her office in the brick building and waited. The transfer document was not what Daniel Marsh believed it was. This required some explanation, and the explanation required going back 4 months, to the moment Eleanor had finished mapping the architecture of what he had built and understood it completely. Understood not just what he planned to do, but the specific vulnerability in the plan, the place where it would fail if someone who understood it as well as he did applied exactly the right pressure at exactly the right time. The vulnerability was this. The plan required Eleanor's name to be destroyed before she understood what was happening. It required that the Harbor families lose trust in her before she had the opportunity to demonstrate otherwise. And it required Daniel to be the one who stepped forward, publicly, with what he would claim were reluctantly obtained documents, after the collapse. The plan could not survive her being in the room, lucid and documented, when the collapse was supposed to happen. So Eleanor decided to control when the collapse happened. She had spent 3 months building the architecture quietly, every step calculated, every document prepared with Nora's guidance, reviewed by an attorney who had known Eleanor for 20 years, and who had, when Eleanor explained the situation, sat very still for a long moment before saying, with the particular directness of someone who had spent a career parsing the difference between what things were and what they appeared to be, "This is the most methodical thing I have ever been asked to help with, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." The document Eleanor had signed in the glass tower was a transfer of Voss Maritime Consulting's administrative operations to a new managing entity. Daniel believed that entity was one he controlled. He had, over the previous 6 months, believed he was maneuvering Eleanor toward a kind of managed retirement, a face-saving exit that would leave him in charge of the firm and its relationships. He had been very careful. He had been, she acknowledged, genuinely skilled. The entity he believed he controlled had been structured by Nora's legal team. Every signature Daniel had collected, every document he had moved, every email he had sent from his work computer and from his personal accounts, which Nora's investigator had been building a case around for the past 2 months, was now part of a file that existed in 3 places: Nora's office, Eleanor's attorney, and a third location that Eleanor had chosen with a specific kind of satisfaction: the Port Authority's compliance office. Marcus Fenn had introduced her to the compliance officer 3 weeks ago, at a meeting Marcus had arranged without explaining why, which was a quality Eleanor had always appreciated about him. He made introductions without editorializing. He simply put 2 people in a room and trusted that they were both honest enough to recognize each other. The compliance officer was a woman named Agnes Park, who had worked in Port Authority regulation for 22 years and who had, within the first 10 minutes of their conversation, shown Eleanor a file she had been building independently. A collection of discrepancies between what the Carrington Group's development applications claimed about community support and what the documentary evidence actually showed. Agnes had been unable on her own to trace the source of the falsified support documents. She had suspected they originated inside the Port Authority. She had not suspected they originated in Voss Maritime Consulting. She had certainly not suspected they had been created by someone using Eleanor Voss's forged signature. When Eleanor laid her evidence on the table alongside Agnes's, the combined picture was complete. Not merely complete, overwhelming. It was the kind of evidence that did not leave room for interpretation. Agnes had looked at it for a long time. Then she had said quietly, "How long have you been building this?" 91 days, Eleanor said. Agnes had looked at her with an expression Eleanor recognized because she had seen it on her own face in the elevator mirror of the glass tower. The expression of a person who has already decided. "What do you need from me?" Agnes said. Eleanor told her. The morning the compliance office issued its formal notification to the Carrington Group, Eleanor was at her desk in the brick building, facing the harbor. The light was the specific green-gray of early spring, the water restless under a low sky, and the smell coming through the slightly open window was the old smell. Salt and diesel, and something faintly metallic that was probably the North Docks, probably the equipment her father's generation had used, somehow still present in the grain of the air after all these years. She had left a message for Daniel the night before, a brief, professional message, the kind she sent routinely, about a client meeting, asking him to come in early. There was nothing in it that would alarm him. It was ordinary. He arrived at 8:45. She heard his footsteps in the hallway. She had always been able to distinguish his footsteps from the others. A particular cadence she had come to associate with competence and reliability, and all the other qualities she had mapped onto him before she understood that what she was reading was not who he was, but who he had decided, very carefully, to appear to be. She had Nora on the phone, muted, in her coat pocket. She had her attorney in a car outside. She had 2 documents on her desk, both facing up, both legible from the doorway. Daniel appeared in the door. He was wearing his good jacket, the gray one, the one he wore when he expected to meet someone important. She had noticed, over the years, that he was very deliberate about clothes. He curated his appearance with the same precision he brought to everything else. "You wanted to see me?" he said. She looked at him. She let the silence run for a moment longer than comfortable. Then she said, "I wanted you to see something." She gestured to the documents on the desk. He came forward. He looked down at them. She watched him read. She watched his face move through several expressions. The first was confusion, studied and genuine-looking. The second was concern, equally practiced. The third was something she had never seen on his face before. It was very small. It was the expression of a person who has just realized they are not in the room they believed they were in. The documents were, first, a complete copy of the Compliance Office's formal notification, with a summary of the evidence underlying it. Second, a letter from her attorney detailing the specific fraudulent documents that bore her forged signature, the employment contract clause and its intended function, and the full record of the email correspondence conducted from Daniel's work and personal accounts. He was still looking at them when she said, quietly, "I have been doing this work for 40 years. I have built this firm. I have made it possible for every family on this harbor to survive in a world that wanted to erase them. And I have done it by being precisely and consistently a person whose word means something." She paused. "You understood that. You understood it better than almost anyone I have ever known, because you studied it carefully. And you used what you understood as a blueprint for taking it apart." He looked up from the documents. His expression had settled into something she recognized, and that recognition gave her an unexpected pang. Not sympathy, exactly, but something more complicated. The expression was the one people wore when they had been carrying something for a very long time, and the weight had become too familiar to feel like weight anymore, until suddenly it did. "You don't know everything," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I know enough." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "This isn't how it was supposed to go." "I know," she said. "It very rarely is." What came out over the following weeks, through the compliance investigation and through the process of unwinding what Daniel had built, was the dimension of the story that Eleanor had not fully anticipated. Not the structure. She had mapped the structure correctly, almost entirely. But the interior of it. The reason. It was Nora who found it. She had been cross-referencing Daniel's professional history, the standard documentation that an investigator assembled before presenting a case, and she had found something that required a second look, then a third. She had called Eleanor on a Tuesday evening, which was not one of their regular call days, and Eleanor had known from the ring it was a particular thing, the way a phone rang when the call was necessary rather than routine, that this was something. Nora described what she had found in the way she described everything, carefully, precisely, without editorializing. The freight company that Daniel's family had lost. The one that had been taken from them by a larger operator in a contract dispute 3 decades ago. The one whose loss had been, by Daniel's account, the defining wound of his life and the source of the grief Eleanor had recognized and responded to, because she recognized grief that came from having something taken. The larger operator who had orchestrated the contract dispute was not a faceless corporation. It had been a small firm, a bridge-building firm, operating in the intersection of traditional maritime communities and new institutional money. It had been run by a woman who had spent years cultivating trust on both sides, and had used that trust, in one specific and terrible instance, to facilitate an acquisition that had destroyed a smaller competitor. The woman's name was not Eleanor Voss. It was Eleanor Voss's former partner. The partner who had betrayed Eleanor at 29, taken the first version of her firm, and used its assets and relationships to build something larger and more profitable and entirely without conscience. Eleanor had not known about the Marsh family freight company. She had not known about the contract dispute. She had spent years after the betrayal documenting what had been done to her and pursuing what limited legal remedies were available to her. But she had not been able to track, in the fog of rebuilding, everything that her former partner had done with the assets he had taken from her. She sat with this for a long time. She sat with the specific shape of it, that Daniel Marsh had grown up in the wound left by her former partner, using her name, the name that had been on the door when the wound was inflicted, and had believed, for years, perhaps his entire career, that he was delivering justice. That the woman who had destroyed his family's company was the same woman he was carefully, methodically dismantling. That the Harbor families he was helping to betray were the same Harbor families who had enabled the betrayal of his. He was wrong. He had been wrong from the beginning. He had attached his grief to the wrong name, and she had walked into it because she had looked at his grief and recognized it as her own, and had trusted him because of that recognition, and the trust had been the precise mechanism of his plan. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about it in the way you think about something that changes the shape of what you know, without changing the facts of what was done. The forged signatures were real. The falsified documents were real. The Harbor families who had been maneuvered toward a development they didn't want, using information they had shared in confidence, were real. The damage to Miriam Taggart's ability to trust the bridge? Real. The damage to Marcus Fenn's certainty? Real. And Daniel Marsh's grief? Also real. Also genuine. Also the consequence of a real wrong that had been done to a real family in a city farther north, in a winter she had not witnessed, by a man who had used her name and her work as his cover. She was not the one who had destroyed his family's company, but she had trusted the person who did. She had built her first firm with that person. She had given him access to everything she knew about every family and every relationship she had cultivated, because she had trusted him completely. And that trust had been the precise mechanism of the first betrayal, just as it had been the mechanism of the second. 2 betrayals, 1 wound. Hers, and the one it had left behind in a world she hadn't known it had touched. She called Nora back. "I need to do something," she said. "I know," Nora said. "It's complicated." "Yes," Nora said. "Most true things are." She met Daniel for the second time in the week after the compliance case had concluded, not in her office, in a place they had both been before, without knowing it connected them. A small restaurant 2 blocks from the water, the kind that had been there since before either of them had arrived in the city, with wooden booths and the kind of light that made everything look like a photograph from a time before everything became complicated. She had chosen it because it was neutral ground, and because the food was honest, and because she needed to be somewhere that did not feel like a stage. He came because she had asked him to, and he had no particular reason to refuse. The legal processes were in motion, the consequences were determined, and whatever Eleanor Voss wanted to say to him at this point was something he had, she suspected, known was coming for longer than he had admitted to himself. He looked tired. Not the way a person looks tired after a bad week. The way a person looks tired when they have been carrying something for years and the thing has finally been set down, even if it was set down badly, even if the landing was wrong. She told him what she had found, what Nora had found, the name of her former partner, the date of the contract dispute, the records she had been able to locate through Nora's firm and a private investigator of the acquisition that had ended his family's company. She watched him as she said it. She watched the sequence of his expressions, which moved in ways she had not entirely predicted. First, the quick resistance of someone who has lived with a version of a story for so long that an alternate version feels like an attack. Then something slower, more internal. The visible work of a person revising a foundational belief in real time. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "My grandfather's name was on the building." "I know," she said. "The documents said Voss Maritime." "The documents were in the firm's name," she said. "The firm he had taken from me." He used it for 3 years after I left before he rebranded. He used my name as long as it was useful to him. He looked at his hands on the table. He had his father's hands, she thought. Broad, deliberate, the hands of someone who grew up working near water. I have been building this for 8 years, he said. I know. I thought... He stopped, started again. I thought I was the one doing justice. I know that too, she said. She looked at him across the table. The light in the restaurant made everything look older and quieter than it was. The man who destroyed your family's company destroyed mine first, she said. I rebuilt. I built something that was genuinely a bridge, genuinely committed to protecting people like your family because of people like your family. Because of what I understood about what it cost to have something taken. And you spent 8 years dismantling it because his name was on the door when the wrong was done. The silence between them had a texture. It was not comfortable. It was not hostile either. It was the particular silence of two people sitting in the full weight of something that cannot be undone, but can, possibly, be understood. What happens now? He said finally. She thought about the Harbor families, about Miriam Taggart, who had grown up in the same blocks she had, whose grandfather and her father had worked the same docks, who had believed in Eleanor's bridge because she had watched Eleanor build it from the first plank. About Marcus Fenn, who did not trust easily and who had trusted her for 20 years. About Agnes Park, who had sat across from her in a government office with a file of discrepancies and recognized immediately the particular quality of someone who had already decided. About her father's hands, the specific, irreducible smell of honest work. I rebuild, she said. That's what I do. She paused. And you, she said, have a choice about what you do with what you now know. She did not forgive him. She wanted to be precise about that, because precision mattered, and because the word forgiveness was used carelessly in the world, attached to resolutions that were actually something else, relief or exhaustion, or the social requirement to appear to have moved on. Eleanor Voss did not appear to have moved on. She actually moved forward, which was different, and which required her to be honest about what was real. What was real? The harm was real. The Harbor families had been maneuvered. Miriam had spent months uncertain about a trust that had taken a lifetime to build. Marcus had gone through something he should not have had to go through. The Carrington Group had been stopped, but the fact that it had gotten as far as it had, that a forged version of her signature had circulated through the Port Authority without her knowing, was itself a damage to the thing she had spent decades constructing. What was also real? Daniel Marsh had spent 8 years targeting the wrong person for a genuine wound that had been inflicted by someone else using her name. He had been wrong in his method, wrong in his target, and devastatingly wrong in the specific harm he had caused to the very communities he had believed he was avenging. And what was also real? In a register she could acknowledge without it changing what had been done. She understood the grief. She understood what it meant to build trust, to give a person everything, and have them use that trust as the precise instrument of destruction. She had felt that. She had survived that. She had sworn she would never trust that completely again. And then she had done exactly that. Twice. The false belief. This time is different. This person is different. She sat in her office, in the brick building, looking at the harbor, and she did something she had not done in a long time. She opened the oldest of the black notebooks, the one from the year after the first betrayal, the one she had written in the language of a woman who had nothing left and was deciding whether to rebuild. She read through it slowly, for the first time in years. Her handwriting in that notebook was different, smaller, more careful. The handwriting of someone conserving space because they were not certain of future pages. She had been certain of nothing in that year. She had built the bridge anyway, one plank at a time. Because the alternative was to become the kind of person who stopped believing in bridges, and she did not think she could survive being that person. She closed the notebook. She looked out at the harbor. The water was the green-gray of a morning in transition, moving from night toward full day, neither one thing nor the other. She thought, some truths don't need anyone to carry them. They only need time. The blinking red light at the end of the North Pier was visible, even in the growing daylight. In, out, in its patient and permanent rhythm. She had watched that life from her bedroom window as a child. She had watched it from boats, from this office, from her father's boat the morning he told her that the harbor was not just a place, it was a promise. The promise that there would always be something to come back to, if you could hold on long enough. She thought about Daniel Marsh and the 8 years he had spent building something that had been aimed at the wrong target, and had therefore destroyed, most completely, himself. She thought about her former partner, whose name she did not allow herself to say, because there were some things she had chosen not to give room in her life, and who had set in motion, probably without thinking about it, probably as an afterthought, the ordinary collateral damage of someone whose ambitions did not leave room for the full weight of consequences. 2 separate lives of grief. Hers and the Marsh family's. She thought about her father, who had worked for 31 years and come home every evening and smelled like the sea, and who had never once, to her knowledge, done anything to someone that he would not have been able to explain to their face. Kindness is not weakness, she thought. Sometimes it is the most patient weapon in the world. She picked up the phone. She called Miriam Taggart. She did not say, I want to explain what happened. She did not say, I need you to understand. She said, in the same tone she had used with Miriam since Miriam was a child watching her father work the docks with Eleanor's father. I want to have coffee with you this week. There are some things I've been working on that I think you'll want to know about. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Thursday? Thursday, Eleanor said. She called Marcus Fenn next. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did, with the directness of a man who had decided long ago that hesitation was a kind of lie. There are some things I should have told you sooner, she said. I'd like to fix that. About time, Marcus said. She could hear water in the background. He was at the dock. She could picture it exactly. The north dock in the early morning, the specific sound of the water against the pilings, the smell of the air, the light coming off the water at an angle that made everything look as though it had been placed there deliberately. Thursday? She said. Thursday, he said. She sat for a moment after hanging up, the phone in her hand, the harbor in front of her, the notebook on the desk beside her. Then she opened a new page in the current notebook, the one she had been writing in since the morning she decided, and at the top, in her steady, deliberate hand, she wrote a single line. Not a note about what had happened, not a plan for what came next. Just the date, the weather, a record of the morning. The harbor was green-gray and restless under a low sky. The light at the end of the North Pier was blinking, as it always had, as it always would, in its patient and particular rhythm. Somewhere below the window, in the direction of the water, she could smell, or believed she could smell, which was perhaps the same thing, something old and salt-edged and entirely familiar. She breathed it in. She held it. Then she turned to a fresh page, picked up her pen, and began again. This has been a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.